Hi, my name is Dr. Mike Yeadon. I'm a qualified life science researcher, really. I have a first degree in biochemistry and toxicology, and have a research-based PhD in respiratory pharmacology. And then I've worked for 32 years, mostly in big pharmaceutical companies, and 10 years in the biotechnology sector. So my last job in big pharma, I was the vice president and chief scientist of allergy and respiratory research. I left Pfizer in 2011. And then after that, I founded, grew, and sold a biotech company called Xiarco to Novartis. That was 2017. And so before that and afterwards, an independent advisor to over 30 startup biotechnology companies. So you would expect from that I am pro new medicines of all kinds. Our goals always were to address unmet medical need and to do so with acceptable safety given the medical context. And I'm in favour of all modes of new medical treatments, whether they're biologicals or vaccines, small molecules, creams, sprays, ointments, whatever. But I'm fervently against unsafe medicines or medicines used in an inappropriate context. And so some of the things I'm going to say are not favourable to the current crop of gene-based vaccines, and it's for that reason that they're being inappropriately used, and I don't think they have a sufficient safety profile to be used as a sort of wide spectrum public health prophylactic. As a result of that background in pharmaceutical industry and biotechnology, I am pro new medical entities that treat unmet need and do so safely. And that's true whether the entity is a vaccine or a biological, like an antibody, or if it's what I would call a small molecule therapeutic, a pill or a tablet. But I'm anti unsafe medicines, regardless of what format they are. And so my criticisms sometimes fall onto unsafe small molecule substances and sometimes on unsafe vaccines. So I'm generally pro new medicines as long as they are safe and effective and used appropriately. This year marks the 40th year I've been studying, continuing to learn and to apply biology broadly, whether it's pharmacology, biochemistry, molecular biology, toxicology. And so I've got a very broad grounding in all things to do with life science in terms of health and disease. What we were being told about this virus and what we needed to do in order to stay safe was simply not true. For example, early on in the UK, there were enormous changes made in attribution of causes of death. So we'd never had anything as absurd as the rule that is now used. So if you should die within 28 days of having a positive result in an inappropriate test using molecular biology, then you would be declared to have died of COVID-19. That's just wrong. It's not just a matter of disagreeing professionally, it's just complete nonsense. And we can certainly talk about the unreliability, untrustworthy nature of PCR testing, but also things like lockdown. I mean, just the whole phrase of it, the fact that it was completely unprecedented, and that we basically were to minimize contact one with another, and that was going to save us. I knew quite early on that was rubbish, and the reason is simple, that only people who are ill and have symptoms are really strong infectious risks to other people. And those people are not people who are walking around in the community, because if you're full of virus and symptomatic, you are also ill. And ill people tend to stay at home or in bed, or if they're very serious, they end up in hospital or die. And so the idea that if you cut normal contacts at work and just civic society and your normal economy, that would slow epidemic spreading, I was fairly sure fairly on that was bunk. And unfortunately, it took several months before that was clear, by which time the idea that lockdown is what you need to do had been pretty much cemented in most of the world. None of the key themes that you hear talked about, from asymptomatic transmission to top-up vaccines, not one of those things is supported by the science. Every piece is a cleverly chosen adjacency to something that probably is true but is itself a lie. Yeah, when I first heard the phrase lockdown, for example, I hope, like most people, I thought this is a phrase you use in relation to controlling unruly prisoners. It's a control measure. And I think pretty much all that has happened since is to do with control. This myth of asymptomatic transmission, which is simply not true, as I mentioned earlier. In order to transmit a virus to be a good, efficient source of infection, you have to have a lot of virus. And if you have a lot of virus in you, the virus is attacking you and you are fighting back. That process produces symptoms inevitably. It's not just occasionally, it must always happen. And so all people who are very good sources of infection are ill. So the whole idea of asymptomatic transmission, I would think if it occurs at all, it's like 1% or 0.1%, as good as a strong infectious case. So by the time we got to about the third main theme of this pandemic and how to control it, I knew I was being lied to. Government policy from the beginning, before even the virus arrived in our country, has turned decades of understanding of how to protect people from infectious diseases on its head. So we've never used lockdown before, and the good reason for that is it's not effective. I've just explained that you need to be symptomatic in order to be infectious. So what we do is we quarantine the sick. We've always done that. We've quarantined the sick because that's how you avoid infecting, the wider population. So the idea of quarantining the well, this so-called lockdown, is a new invention, and it has no foundations whatsoever, either in science or in the history of controlling epidemics. Also, mass testing of people without symptoms has no underpinning science at all. It's just a way of frightening people. And this idea, for example, that you can be ill even though you have no symptoms, and you can be a respiratory virus threat to someone else even though you have no symptoms, that's also invented in 2020. There's simply no history of it, and it defies common sense as well. And yet, time and time again, lockdown, asymptomatic transmission, use of high multiplication molecular biology tools, just over and over again, wearing masks. All of these things have either never been used before, or we already knew that they didn't work. No one is paying me to do this. I'm receiving absolutely nothing except criticism, social isolation from my peers. So what I would tell you, the reason I think you can trust what I'm saying is sincere, is that I'm paying to do this, right? I have lost work. I have had people I've known for decades no longer want to speak to me. So I'm very sincere in what I'm doing. I'm warning you that governments around the world, and certainly yours locally, is lying to you in various ways that are easy for you to establish. If you choose not to do that, there's nothing someone like me can do about it, okay? You've been subject to propaganda and lies by people who are very well trained in how they do that, and I'm a complete amateur. One of the reasons I went into the commercial sector early on was I wanted to do applied research. I wanted to be part of teams that would hopefully find new cures. Very much. I've always liked applied research. How things work, why they sometimes don't, what we could do about that. That's the love of my life. But I had some peers of mine who wanted to do blue sky research. And back in the 80s, I guess, they could do that. They could maybe get a position to university and apply for grants, and then they could literally pursue things they thought were interesting. And if they made good progress, that would often attract more funding. So they were driving the research. The pharmaceutical industry now, as much as it ever was, still wants to pursue applied research. So some of the methods have changed, but the objective is pretty much as it was when I joined it in the 80s. But my academic friends report things are very different for them in universities. These days, the major funding bodies are still governments, but they tend to decide sort of directional themes, often agreed internationally. And basically, if your research falls into one of those themes, you might get funded, and if it doesn't, you literally will be starved out. Because the only other source of funding are large private institutions. So in Britain, for example, biggest one is the Medical Research Council, which is basically public money. And the next one is the Wellcome Trust, which is a very large endowment and is used to drive research that's of interest to its management. And so, basically over time, and more recently, academic researchers pretty much have to toe the line. So if there are certain thematic areas that are being pursued by private funding or endowments and scholarships and so on that comes from private foundations, those are the areas you have to work in. And it becomes quite difficult. Independent research is not only not supported, it's often not tolerated. And that makes, I think it has made them very easily persuaded, should we say, over the last year to do what they are told. And most importantly, and I've spotted this many times, they won't contest the COVID narrative. So over the last 3 months, I've spoken to 8 professors at UK universities whose discipline includes immunology. And I've discussed with them what I'm going to tell you about virus variants. And they've all agreed with my interpretation. None of them will say anything. And it's because I won't get a grant from the Wellcome Trust or the Medical Research Council as suggested. I won't get grants if I speak about this stuff. So I want you to know that the academics in your country are easily pushed around, frankly, by both politicians and people with lots of money. Then in summary, the main change I've noticed over the last probably 40 years really is that university research has moved away from being directed mostly by the head of a department and individual researchers and to be now much more directed from the centre, from governments and from those that provide most of the grant funding. And it's to be regretted, I think. There are obviously some advantages. It means that the resources of a country do get focused in certain areas, and who's to say that they're not the right ones. But I think the key thing to note is that the academics are no longer independent. So if you expect a university professor to be knowledgeable, yeah, they probably are. But if you expect them to be honest and independent, then you're naive, because they've got to pay attention to where they're, who's buttering the bread, who's providing their funding, and they're not able to be independent anymore. Probably the only people you're going to find who are truly independent are former biotechnology CEOs, people like me. So I'm not a member of any club, nobody pays me. And maybe some retired academics. Most of them still won't speak out because they still have connections to their old departments. They might have an emeritus position. So there are very, very few truly independent people, and the rest are subject to the influences you would expect if money comes from a very small number of sources. And so one of the really seriously and upsettingly misleading kind of themes that you hear very often is the implication, perhaps even the statement, that what gives you immunity to something, some infectious disease, is whether you've got antibodies to that thing. And I think they have done that because most people think that antibodies are what confers immunity. And certainly antibodies are quite important against certain infections, certainly bacterial infections. If you don't have antibodies, it can be very difficult. But that's not the only part of your immunity. And importantly, the immunity to viruses doesn't really rely on antibodies at all. And I'll just explain why that is. Viruses are really tiny things, really tiny. And their business is to get as quickly as they can inside your cells. So they bind to a receptor on the surface and inject themselves into your cell. They're inside. Antibodies are big molecules and they're generally outside your cells. So just think about that for a moment. Antibodies and viruses are in separate compartments. The virus is inside the cell, the antibodies are outside the cell. So I'm not saying antibodies have no role, but they're really not very important. And this has been proven. There are some people in whom a natural experiment has occurred. They have a defect and they actually don't make antibodies, but they're able to fight off COVID-19, the virus SARS-CoV-2, quite well. And the way they do that is they have what's called T-cell immunity, cellular immunity, and there are cells that are trained, as it were, to detect virus-infected cells and to kill those cells. And that's how you defend yourself against a virus. So all of these mentions of antibody levels, it's just bunk. It is not a good measure of whether or not you're immune. It does give the idea that it does give evidence that you've been infected, but their persistence is not important to whether you've got immunity. And so I feel I've noticed The emphasis on antibodies, I think, is really a psychological operation to convince you, a member of the public, that you do know that it's antibodies that confer immunity, and so when they fall away, well, you must be losing immunity. I'm sorry, it's not true. There are multiple arms of your immune system, and what's almost never talked about is T-cell or cellular immunity. It's not a new thing either. We've known this for decades. So it's not like, maybe there's something about T-cells. It's being implied that T-cells are a kind of recently come on the scene, and maybe there are questions about how important it is. Absolute rot. We've known about T-cells for decades. They were clearly in my undergraduate textbooks, and we've known about their importance in defending you against respiratory viruses since probably the 1970s, certainly the 1980s. So don't believe anything where people suggest to you that their role is uncertain. That's just bullshit. We've known for a very long time that they're absolutely central, and I would like to explain why the virus variants story is just yet another lie, and it involves T-cells. Your immune system has multiple components to it because you are susceptible to infectious threats of various kinds: parasites, fungi, bacteria, viruses. Those would be the main categories. Well, obviously, they invade and threaten you in completely different ways. It would not be surprising then to learn that you've got 4 or 5 different arms of the immune system: innate immunity, mucosal, antibody, T-cells, and complement. There are all of these different wonderful systems that are integrated one with another because it needs to defend you against all sorts of different threats in the environment. And what I'm telling you is that the emphasis on antibodies in respect of respiratory viral infections is wrong, and you can establish that quite easily by doing some searching. And therefore, once you've established that for yourself, then you'll probably realize, well, why do they keep telling us about antibodies when they're probably not very important at all?